Hello. So today in this tutorial we are going to keep building on top of those serializers implementation. On the previous video we talked about how to use the basic serializer structure from Django REST framework. So which is this here on the documentation inside API guide serializers. So using the raw serializer implementation, and today we are going to build a report based on this implementation that we have done, which is the transaction model. So what we want to do here is to create a report that groups all the categories and sum the amount that the user have already expended in each of those categories, so they can have an overview of the information, and then we are going to both to get some input to filter the data, for example, for a period of time, and also to render this report in an API view, so the front end or the mobile application can get this data and render in a chart, a bar chart, or just show it in a table. So basically what we have here on the list transactions, this is just a regular model view set where we are listing all the transactions from a given user. So this is the my user account here, and on the category home, and there is this 200 euros expense, and as we can see here we have several transactions, over 1000 here for this user. So the first thing, before jumping into the serializer implementation, let's implement this report using just a basic function. So here inside the core app, let's create a module, call it reports, and then let's create like a transaction report. And because we are going to list this information for each category, I'm going to return the total there. The format that we want to give to the user is a list of data, and a basic query should look something like that. Let's import. So I'm importing here the transaction from our model, this one here. And the way the group by queries on Django works is that you have to set here the list of values that you want to retrieve. So I want to group by category, and then for each category I want to annotate the data with a total, which is the sum, and then we import this from Django DB models. Okay, so we have here average, for example, and other operations as well, and we have count to know how many transactions we have for each category. And actually it's should be a good example as well. So we get here amount, right? And we can count how many transactions we have, counting by the ID. And we can have an average as well. Oops, from the amount. And then for each of those transactions here, we need to, just before we add this to the data, let's just return the query set. Okay, remove this from now. Okay, so this should be the base query that we are going to be working on, and we can test this on the console. So let's just rerun this here. So from core.reports, for transaction report. So we have here the output is going to be the execution, okay? And then here we can see for the category number 2, we have 252,500 transactions, and the average is 500 per transaction. And we have here other data, because those are all random, they should be looking like more or less the same. And for category 4, we have here only 3 transactions and totaling almost 3,000. And the average is more or less 900 for each transaction. And so this basically is the data that we want to work with. And but to make things easier, when we are returning the data, we can create like a data class here, because for example I want to show to the user which transaction this actually is, because I just have the primary key here, so I want to show an object which is the transaction. And we can create using a data class like report entry. And the report entry should have like a category, which is going to be an instance of our category model, this one here. And then I should have here a total, which is going to be a decimal. So I'm importing here from the standard library, a decimal field. And we have count, which should be an integer. And the average, which should be a decimal as well. Okay. And right, so now I need to translate this query set into this data class here. So now let's get here the data, and we go here for each entry in the query set. I'm going to create a report entry. Oops, report entry. Okay, and then I can pass this information here in this order. But then at this point I don't have a category instance. Something that you can do here is to retrieve this from the database. And we make a query here using the name of the field is just category, okay? And then we have category, the entry total, the entry count, the entry average, yeah, and this can stay in a single line. And then we append this information here to our list, okay? And then we are going to say that this is not really a good idea to run this query here, because then this get on the database is going to repeat for each of those records that we have here. For example, let's check the length. So we have 3 categories here, so I would run one time here this database query, so it's 1. And then 3 times this one here. So to get this report, I would have 3 database queries. But then we are going to improve that later on. First thing, let's see if this is actually working. So let's just get the transactions report and getting the output. Oops, I'm just returning the query set here. Let's try again. And then out. So now you can see that the output changed a little bit. Let's get the first one just to inspect. So now if we look here on the debug, so we have the average and the category. We actually now have the Django model here that we can use to serialize later on, and the count and the total of transactions in this particular category. Okay, and then just to illustrate this database optimization, we can import from Django.db connection, and then we can see here how many queries it executed. So I have here 4 database queries, and if we try to run the report again, it should say 8 now. And then if you only have just a few categories, this is perfectly fine. But if you have like 1,000 different categories, something that I like to do to improve this data access here is to create an index of categories. So create like categories index, and then you create a dictionary, and then you make one database query. So for each category in category.objects.all, and then you create here the category index, and you set as the key being the primary key, and you assign here the category. Okay, and then here instead of making a new database query, you can just use your index, and then you get based on the ID here. Okay, so let's see if it works. Okay, the code is working. We can get here the first one and see the total. Oops. And then we can inspect the number of queries again. So now we only have 2 database queries, and the thing is, it's going to be linear. No matter how many categories that you have on your database, this report is always going to require only 2 database queries. So if we try again here, this should be 4, I mean 2 plus 2 and then 4. So yeah, this is just a small improvement. And then maybe we can start already creating a way to visualize this data. So now the trick is going to be creating a serializer for this data class. Okay, so here on the serializers, I'm going to create a report entry serializer, and it's just going to be a regular serializer. Okay, and then on the category, it's going to be a category serializer, and then the total is going to be a serializer dot decimal field, and then we set the max digits being 15 and decimal places just to count integer field, and then the average is also a decimal field. Okay, and now we need just to create a regular API view So let's go here to views. Let's create something like transaction report API view. Going to be a regular API view. And then we define here just the get and the request. And then we are going to do something like that. Data equals to transaction report. Okay. And then the serializer is going to be the serializer that we just created. And as the instance, I'm going to pass the data. And because data here is a list of those entries, we should pass here many, true. And then we just return a response. So I just imported here response from the Django REST framework.response. So this class here. And then as the data, I'm going to return the serialized data. Okay. And then now we need to add this view here to our URLs conf. And we are going to call this report, then views, transaction report API view as view. And the name, let's just call it report. Okay, this should be enough. Maybe we can create here a new folder, or let's just add as a report. And then the URL here is report. Okay, so this is what our data looks like. Okay, so now we have the category here, we have the ID and the name, and the total, count, and average for each of those categories, right? And the benefit of using a serializer, one is that you make the data structure explicit. And because if you are just dealing with a list of dictionaries, sometimes things are difficult to understand your data structure, because you may inject a particular key based on some rules. So it obfuscates some of the business logic there. And also because you make it standard how you are rendering the data. Because here I'm always rendering the data, the decimal as a string, and I'm fixing 2 decimal places. And if you look at the raw data that we had, for example, here we had several decimal places. And then if you serialize that, the same thing here for the sum on the total. So if you do that by hand, creating this list of dictionaries that you are going to return on the response, you have to pay attention to format the data so you have a consistent output. And and the serializer just make things easier, and the code is way cleaner. And you have all the benefits of like implementing these nested serializers and so on, right? Okay, so the issue that we have now is that first we are not authenticating the user. So it's just creating a report for all the transactions on the database. We are not making a slice of data here that is only looking at the transactions from this particular user who is asking for the report. And so we can fix that also using a serializer to read the data and then pass that as an object to our report function. So here we could create a serializer that like a parameter serializer that is going to read the data here, and then I'm going to pass this data here as a parameter to the report. Okay, so we can create something like that, like report params serializer. And I want to accept like a date range, which is going to be a date time field. So I start date and I end date. And I also want to get the user. So we can use a hidden field and put as the default the current user that is on the request. Okay. So now we can use this here to get, and this time I'm not going to use an instance because I'm reading the data, so I should read from here, and I'm going to access the request.data. Okay, and I want to make this view, it should require authentication because I want to always expect a user to be on the request. Okay, and then now we can also create a data class to store the parameters. So we create here report params, and I start date is going to be a date time field, and the end date is going to be also date time field, and the user is going to be an instance of the user model from the Django application. So I'm importing here from Django contrib of models, importing the user, and then I need to receive that as a parameter here, and we can use data notation here as well. So just the ID is going to help us out. And now, before getting the values, I want to filter the query set based on, I want only transactions from the user that made the request. The date should be greater or equal to the params.startDate, but also the date should be less or equal to the end date. Okay. And now we have this here, and then on my serializer we can set the create method, because on the create I want to return an instance of report parameters. So we could put here like the start date as being the validated data dot start date. So we can list here all the data, but because they have the same signature here, the name of the fields, we can just explode it like that. Validated date. Okay. So now what is going to happen here is actually I can now validate the user input. So if it's not valid, I just want to return a 400. And if the data is valid, I want to create an instance of this data class, which is the report params. And then I'm going to feed these parameters here to the transaction report. and then we are going to process the request based on this data and just return as we did. So let's see if it works. First, we should get an authentication error, right? So let's set the authentication here. We are using API key, yeah. Okay, so now we are getting here a 500 and server error because actually we are not passing any data there to the request. Let's see if we can find it here. Oh no, sorry. We are getting here this error because when we use this hidden field using the current user default, it expects to have the request on the context. So if here before instantiating, we need to pass some extra context, being the request here, so the serializer can know how to resolve the user field. Okay, let's try again. All right. So the benefit here of using a serializer is that now it's validating for us the input. So I'm making here mandatory for the user to pass a start date and an end date to use this report. So let's try it here. Start date as being 2020 and then 0. And then until 2021, 31, 23, 59, 59. Okay, so it's not working still. Actually, we don't pass the data here. It's just the get, parameter. Let's try again. Now let's see what's the problem. Yeah, here. Okay. All right, so we have here now just two categories. I don't know if you recall, but the previous one we had 3. That's because it was from the other user that we have on the database. For example, if we use the other user, it's Maria, she should have less data here. So only those transactions here from the home category and the tech category, and here we are just returning this slice of information. I can't recall I know that there is less transactions. Let's see the date range if we can simulate the date field. I think they are all on the same date. So here we can check, for example, if we make a report until 16, so we don't get any data. But then if I increase the range here to the next day, we have all the data here. So basically that's how I like to use this kind of implementation. That is also here that I forgot. We can also filter here just the categories from the relevant user, which is user, parameters.user. Okay. To improve this query here a little bit. But anyway, that's how I like to implement this kind of report. So we are dealing here with an aggregation of data which are not a Django model, so there is no limit on what you can do with the serializer. It's just a good way to sanitize the user input and also to have a standard format to give the output of the data. Yeah, so I think that's all for now, and I will see you on the next tutorial. Bye bye.